but I use a quote from Dallas Willard that I think is pretty rough, and it slaps you in your face. He says a lot of times people want to be what he calls a vampire Christians. And what he means by that is to say to Jesus, I'll take a little bit of your blood, please, but I really don't want to be your disciple or have a relationship with you. Just get me to heaven, basically, with your blood, and I'm good to go. And so that's the huge slap in the face right there.
Our children are leaving the faith in droves.
As a result.
Oh, I got to pause here.
We're going live right now.
How can we raise our kids to stand firm, have a faith that lasts, and navigate such a time as this?
We're here to report that our nation's capital has just been...
To turn the nation, you have to take the next generation.
Today in the news, COVID-19 number.
I'm Jake McCandless, and this is my podcast, Stand Firm Parents. We're working together to help our children have a faith that lasts.
And now, here's Jake McCandless.
Defining things help, right? And it helps if you have the right definition. Sometimes you need to define things. That's what we're going to do today. And we're going to define a topic that we've talked about a lot. Discipleship. Now, we've talked about doing discipleship, and I think we've given some great things. The first series, when we started this new video format and this partnership with LifeWord, was to talk about us as parents being disciple makers in our home. I felt like it was helpful to define my role as a parent as a disciple maker. But what should a disciple even look like? And where do we get that definition? That's where we're going today here on Stand Firm Parents. I'm Jake McCandless here in LifeWord Studios. I have a guest today who I've been friends with for over 20 years now. I can't believe that. Man, I'm dating myself, really dating him. But we're going to have an incredible conversation about defining what it means to be a disciple and then to replicate that and make other disciples. But I want you to think about it. What is a disciple? Where we're going with this thing? Where are you going with your kids? Now, the go-to answer is to say, hey, we're to become more like Jesus. Absolutely true, but that can be a bit overwhelming. My guest today has a book that really helps define what we're talking about when we talk about being a disciple and discipleship. This conversation is part of the larger conversation asking the question, what does it mean to have our faith fully integrated into our lives? This is something as followers of Christ, us parents, we need to do. But then hopefully that's what we can do with our kids. That's what we need to do with our families. And I believe it's a big part of having a faith that lasts when we integrate faith into everything. Another way of looking at it is, what is the brand of Christianity that we're passing down? We're looking at this idea of a fully integrated faith from a lot of different directions. We've already looked at some. We're going to look at some more. But today, we're talking about lessons from first century discipleship. And we're doing that with my guest, Darren Huckey. Darren is the assistant to the Rabbi at Shalom Macon Messianic Synagogue in Macon, Georgia. He is a husband, father, author, teacher, and posts weekly videos to the Shalom Macon YouTube channel. He has published 7 books to date, with his 8th book due in 2025. For quite a while now, he's been learning about the Jewishness of Jesus, and that has radically changed his life and his understanding of Jesus' call to discipleship. That's the conversation we're having today. He's focused on the last several years connecting the church back to the Jewish roots. Again, Darren lives in Macon, Georgia. I first met Darren when he was living in Arkansas. But we're going to talk in particular about, like I said, 8 books. I think this was his first one. But we're talking about the 4 responsibilities of a disciple. And looking at it from the point of view of first century Judaism. It's a fascinating conversation. Darren, I am asking about a book that you wrote some time ago. My copy says 2013. I actually think I got to see it earlier because I remember getting at least a taste of your work here was emailed to me while I'm in a tree stand. And you've written a lot since then. You've written for us at Stand Firm, and people can find your articles, and hopefully down the road we're going to get some more and keep doing that. But my prior series was on parents being disciple makers.
Right.
This current series, and we're at the start of this, is on having a fully integrated faith, having a holistic faith. And one of the things I find is we can only pass down the Christianity we know. And so trying to broaden what that is. And one of the main thing is, if we're going to make disciples within our home, what is a disciple anyway? And you've written a book called 4 Responsibilities of a Disciple. So good. You go back to and more than just the first century, but go back to the first century in Israel where we find Jesus. I want to talk about that. Before we do, I mean, this isn't a fair question, but where are we getting the current model that we use to describe a disciple, do you think?
Oh man, probably a lot of it's been passed down in Greek culture and then just sort of morphed from there. I think our early model sort of, fell off the path a long time ago. And when the Jewish disciples of Jesus and the Gentile disciples sort of parted ways almost, and then the Jewish disciples almost became non-existent, I think a lot of that just really caused some problems in this area. And, that's one of the things that drove me to write this book is that, you said, we had such a need for making disciples, and especially in our children. And that need drove me to say, hey, we've got all these books out here about creating disciples and multiply and make, all these disciples, everything. But how can I make something if I'm not sure that I am that something? I'm just going to make more of me. But if I'm not what I'm supposed to be, then we're going to have a broken line continuing forever, And so I had to ask that question, and I've talked about this at the beginning of the book, of what is a disciple and am I one? Okay. Oh. And so that's the premise of the book, of instead of how to make disciples, it's how to become a disciple so that we can then make disciples.
I always appreciate the pointing the finger at yourself first and asking that question. Yeah, because I think when we think about disciple, like myself, okay, so I feel a call to ministry, vocational ministry. I'm in high school. All I know is the youth group before me and what they're teaching, what we're hearing preached, the books that I actually do pick up. And so when it comes to discipleship, I'm picking up a book that's taking a really approach that they've come up with now, 2,000 years removed from Jesus doing this thing. And,
right.
Maybe some practical advice there, but Jesus was talking about something very specific. So you take us back to the Jewish understanding in the first century. Right. Why go there and not go to Rome, go to Greece?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Part of what has led me down this path is my interactions and studies and things like this that have led me on a Jewish perspective on Scripture as a whole. But the other thing is, when I started studying this topic, I realized that discipleship actually goes back to specifically a relationship between a rabbi and his disciple, because we have really no other model of this type of relationship in all of the world. And especially during this time period in the first century, it was really in the height of its development, and it's continued on since then. And we see this really modeled very well in Jesus and his disciples. And once we look at that, we see a different relationship of just mentoring or being a role model or all these different roles that we can think of. But this goes back to a specific model between a rabbi and his disciple. And it's very intimate. There's a connection there that's different than other connections. And there's certain responsibilities that are implied and actually assumed that we don't get if we don't dig into this. And so that's what really sort of drove me and when I started looking at this and see, what did Jesus expect of his disciples and how do we apply that today?
And you mentioned your journey, and it's so the interview I just finished wrapped up with a tour guide in Israel, and
Nice.
who stay in regular contact, understanding what's going on. But I didn't even know the word messianic. I didn't even know that Jewish. I mean, it sounds horrible how it's coming out, but the roots and the foundation of Judaism matter.
Right.
And you were actually the first one to introduce this to me, and I didn't even get it. Like I didn't understand you years ago. But now it's a regular part of my life, and I'm like, how can we understand the Bible without? We can't, and we can't understand discipleship.
You know, you said you interviewed a Messianic Jew. Now you're interviewing a Messianic Gentile, because I'm not Jewish. And
when you first came out with this book, you reached out, and I'm like, hey, I want to have you come speak at our church. And I don't know if you remember that. And which we had a great time getting to be with your family. But so, again, it's terrible how far removed the Gentile church is from understanding our foundation. I had you coming, and I didn't even know the difference. I'm like, well, he's Jewish. And so that's why he does these things. And so I'm like, this Jewish guy's coming to speak to us on discipleship. And then I had a conversation with you like the day before, and you like cleared that up. And I remember trying to explain to our leaders, well, he does Jewish stuff, but he's not Jewish. I mean, that's terrible, our mindset. And that's why we need to understand it. So anyway, sorry, I totally blew you up.
He's not Jewish. I tell people I'm not Jewish. I'm just Jew-ish.
Right.
But my journey, we could spend 2-hour podcast on this. But essentially, my journey is just seeking God and seeking to be a better disciple of Yeshua constantly in my life. My wife and I, we've always been on a journey of just pressing into the Lord. We've always been on a journey of serving. We've served in our communities wherever we are, in our congregations, and that started off in both of us started off in the Pentecostal sort of movement and grew up that way. Then we went sort of non-denominational, and then we've found a connection to Messianic Judaism. And that was, we sort of kept things at least I did, kept things at arm's distance for a good while, because just as you said, it's confusing. You don't know what's going on. There's a lot of unfamiliar territory and all that kind of stuff. But the more and the more that I began to just dig down, and I tell you, let me just go back to real quick. One of the highlights and the pivotal points in my life of digging into this is I went to a conference with these scholars. They were not Jewish, but they were scholars on Judaism, and especially how it relates to Christians and Christianity and, things of the first century and stuff like that. And I went to this conference my wife sort of wrote me into early on in our marriage. And I didn't really have an interest. I thought I knew everything I needed to know about the Bible and about Jesus, about faith, all this kind of stuff. And then I was at this conference, and these scholars were talking, and everything was just like, I was going, looking, and it's like, that just went over my head. It's like, where'd that come from? Where'd that go? And it just kept doing that, And I was like, there's got to be something here that I'm missing. And I've got to figure out if these guys are on track or if I am,
right.
And so I just quit my job and went solo doing freelance graphics and all that kind of stuff. And so I had one client and a very small job at that. And so I had nothing but time on my hands before children, BC,
Yeah.
And so I spent literally about 8 hours a day studying and digging into the word and trying to reorient myself with things. And I did that my time, of course, couldn't stay consistent because of workloads and all that kind of stuff. But for the first year, I had a lot of time on my hands. And I studied quite a bit, and I found a lot of resources, found a lot of other people to look into, and then all this stuff started shifting. I realized, first of all, Jesus is Jewish. Right. And that was, it's like one of those obvious type things, but there's a lot of implication in that,
right.
And then I realized all the disciples were Jewish. And guess what? Even all the people at Pentecost, they were Jewish.
Yeah.
And then after, Cornelius and those guys, that's where the Gentiles started coming in. Yeah. And all this stuff started blowing my mind. I was like, okay, so this whole time, my whole life, or whenever we'd hear about Jews and all that kind of stuff, we would try to figure out, well, how do they fit into this?
Right.
And now the paradigm shifted, and I'm like, oh, wow, I shouldn't be asking how they fit into this, but how do we fit into this?
Oh, yeah.
And there's
Marking
a plan
the tape
laid
right
out.
there.
Yeah, in the book of Acts and Paul's letters, and that's Paul's whole ministry is to say, you guys fit into this, and this is how, and I'm doing things different. I'm teaching things different than traditional Judaism of how Gentiles fit in. As a matter of fact, every time he preached in the book of Acts, it didn't matter if he talked about Jesus, didn't matter if Peter talked about Jesus. People were fine with that. They're like, tell me more. But when they got to, okay, now we're going to the Gentiles, they were like, whoa, no, can't do, and that's when everybody broke down and started screaming, hollering, and dragging them out to stone them and everything. So just a big paradigm shift. And so that really reoriented me to get on this path. And from there started digging and, caused me to write. A lot of people do things to process what they're learning.
Right.
I write about it. You do probably a lot of audio, video, talking with people and stuff like that. I write. You do some writing too. Of course, you've done some great work. But that's what I've done. I published 7 books. I'm about to publish my 8th book here shortly.
Okay.
And but the first topic I ever tackled in that regard was my responsibility as a disciple. And so a Jewish framework and a Jewish frame of reference really is critical for all that.
That's it. So, I mean, the paradigm shift, and you're saying, okay, Jesus is Jewish. His disciples are Jews. And so he's doing this disciple thing. Would be best to look at it in this Jewish context. And one of the things you talk about is Jesus wasn't doing anything new. And as a rabbi are gathering disciples. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Right. That's something we mistake. We think of him as a rebel with a cause or a, just completely out of sorts. And the things that he did do different was like love extreme, and be faithful to the Torah, to the commandments, to 100%, live his life as a sinless lamb, and, all these different things that actually made him into the Messiah. And we could go on and on, but even the qualifications for Messiah, if we teach that he, did away with the Torah, the law of Moses or whatever, then he, by definition, cannot be the Messiah because he is preaching against what God said. And so just a whole breakdown, but revelation, but, Jesus is the core of everything that we have to work through, and putting him back in the frame of reference, first century Judaism, I think is super critical, and it helps us understand, and, even understanding and learning about contemporary literature of his day, his contemporaries, what they were teaching, what they were doing, and all that kind of stuff. It really, to me, it puts things in context and opens the teachings of Jesus so much. I'm actually working on another book that I've actually been working on probably for the longest of any book that I've been working on. It's over 10 years now because I'm slowly doing it. And one of the main thing is comparing Jesus's teachings with that of the rabbis. And it is a commentary on a rabbinic work. And so just to show that even though what he taught wasn't necessarily new, how he taught it and how he lived it and displayed it to others, that was huge.
That's incredible. So how would you describe the form of discipleship that's happening there, this interaction between a rabbi and his disciples?
Okay, so first of all, a rabbi would choose his disciples, and they would become his disciples for life. You don't hear of disciples changing rabbis. I mean, there was a situation with a popular artist who was a Jewish man and under a rabbi, probably in the last decade or two, and he ended up, he was following that path, and he switched, and just, you would think the world had fallen apart. I mean, just everything, and that's the sort of the idea. Paul, in a sense, betrayed his Rabbi Gamaliel, in his pursuit of the early believers, because the permission he had to get and the people he had to take authority when they come under their authority were actually in opposition to his rabbi. And so, and that was like, he might as well have almost slit his rabbi's throat,
right?
In that regard. And so a relationship with a rabbi is a super serious thing, not in a bad way, but just like, it's almost like a marriage. I'm not going to betray my wife. I'm not going to run off with another woman, and this is the same thing with the rabbi. And you have a very, very close, intimate relationship. And we can, work to see that in our relationship with Jesus, with Yeshua, and that's his Hebrew name. And we can go into that another time. But, I think a lot of times we want the benefits from Yeshua, from Jesus, without the relationship and without the commitment.
Yeah.
And so I wrote about this in my book, actually, and there's a whole section in this first responsibility. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that out if you don't mind.
Well, I was wondering, so the whole thing is the 4 responsibilities.
Right.
I'm like, are you willing to share those 4 responsibilities?
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to give that, because everybody needs to know that. It's foundational. And if you want more information on those, you can read my book. But, the 4 responsibilities that I've come up with, that I've developed, and I've searched out Jewish sources and the scriptures and things to find, is that they boil down to these 4 things. It boils down to devotion to your rabbi, 2, to memorize your rabbi's teachings. And there's interpretation in there as well, because you don't want to misrepresent him. Then you have imitation. You want to imitate your rabbi. Then you have replication. You want to replicate your rabbi through yourself and your disciples. Okay. So it's devotion, memorization, imitation, replication. Those are the 4 responsibilities that I've laid out in my book. And that first one, devotion, I'll throw another little thing, talk about it more in my book, but I use a quote from Dallas Willard that I think is pretty rough, and it slaps you in your face. He says, a lot of times people want to be what he calls a vampire Christians. And what he means by that is to say to Jesus, I'll take a little bit of your blood, please, but I really don't want to be your disciple or have a relationship with you. Just get me to heaven, basically, with your blood, and I'm good to go. And so that's the huge slap in the face right there. And so that's, devotion is huge. We have to be devoted. And I think with the modern way of how discipleship is perceived, that this is not really happening. Yeah. I think a lot of people are coming to faith as a means of wiping away guilt and then moving on.
Yeah.
And so devotion to our rabbi is key.
And that's not necessarily their fault, because we present really a therapeutic gospel if you get down to it. And that's, I always go back. Jesus said, hey, follow me. And that goes back to this devotion part.
Yeah, exactly. And so the next responsibility is memorization. We should be memorizing our master's words. And I talk about this in the book. That's the one that I struggle with. I can remember passages. I can remember great context. I can remember, parables and specific wording here, specific wording there. But to actually sit down and memorize, that's something I struggle with, and I continue to struggle with. And I'm actually having people work to hold me more accountable to that. And, but we should memorize his every words, because we not only need to know his words, but we need to understand them. And when we know them, we internalize, then we can begin to understand them more fully. And then, I give examples in my book of misinterpreting one's rabbi's teachings, and how there's been historically problems with that. And it's caused some great, great problems. And so when we don't know our rabbi's teachings, and then we misunderstand them, that's huge. And I think that's really what without just sounding like I'm bad-mouthing Christianity of the church, that's where a large portion of Jesus' followers have just really gone astray, because we hear these teachings, and we hear the pastor teaching or evangelist or whatever. And that's the only aspect of that we get. We don't dig into the word. We don't look at other sources. We don't look into Jewish sources of what he's talking about, context, all that kind of stuff. And we build these presuppositions, and they continue to snowball and take us in a direction that he never intended.
As you're saying this, and this may not be fair to throw this at you, but just kind of something that hit me is, so often our teaching is, hey, go live this way. But we're almost saying that out of discipleship. Like it's, okay, there's not following your rabbi and learning, but it's just, hey, go do this. It's like taking these principles of the rabbi rather than listening. Sorry, it derailed, but that's just something, it hit me, and I didn't have time to write it down. So
I totally understand. And unfortunately, usually what happens is it becomes and pardon the expression, becomes a pyramid scheme, in the sense that we just say, come down to the altar, make a decision, now go make disciples. And they don't bring other people, get other people saved. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we believe. We don't know what our foundation is, nothing like that. And so we're just making the same watered down soup over and over again.
Yeah.
So I have a quote in my book that says, one empty pitcher can't fill another. You know,
That's incredible. What I love about this is one, it's not theory, it's not practical. It's going to, okay, this is how Jesus was doing it. But then, I mean, what we're talking about as being a parent and then starting discipleship at home, in one way it makes it easy because we're saying, these are the 4 things you need to do, and these are the 4 things you need to pass down. To me, simplifying it and boiling it down could just completely change discipleship. And I haven't even shared this with you. So we're using quotes from as we're doing our local church groups, meeting in homes and really focusing on discipleship and replication. We're using quotes from this book and really trying to narrow down. I don't think I've ever even passed that on to you. I'm plagiarizing and not even telling you. So it's
all good. That's what it's there for.
I definitely hope they'll check this book out. But I hope they will also look at your other work and what else you have going. And again, we have several articles over at stanfordministries.com that Darren's written, a lot focusing on the feast and how to involve your family into the feast and the celebrations. Darren, could you take us out with, okay, really you gave us a new paradigm for understanding being a disciple and discipleship. How can we start maybe moving in what I would say more of a biblical direction with this?
Wow, it's a good question. I would say maybe along the lines of where I started. Just start learning, absorbing. Find other sources than what you've been chewing on your whole life. I mean, not don't go crazy heretical, stuff like that. And some people may throw me in that camp. I don't know, but just something that helps gain a different perspective, a broader perspective, and puts Jesus back into his original framework. And then take those bits that you learn and apply them. I mean, here's a practical example. There's a Jewish rabbi that has a book on Jesus. And if you need me to, I can send you a link to this. I forget the name of the book. I think it's called Rabbi Jesus or something. And he in the book, I thought this really stood out to me. He said, as I was reading the Gospels for the first time, it said, Jesus took the bread, he lifted it, and he made a blessing. He said, what struck me hard in that moment was that I realized that me as a Jew, I knew the blessing that he gave. But all of his disciples, almost all of his disciples, none of them know the blessing that he gave because they're not Jewish and they weren't raised in that. But Jesus, being raised as a Jew within Judaism, he would have prayed and given a specific blessing for this bread. And, we don't know that. It's because we're completely removed from that context, just little things like that of learning how to imitate Jesus. Not that we have to become Jewish or do everything Jewish or something like that, but just those little things that can enhance our connection to him and make us better disciples of imitating his very actions. Because Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 40, and this is a verse that I use over and over again in the book, it says that everyone, first of all, it says a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. Most people think, how can I ever become like Jesus? Well, you won't be as elevated as Jesus, of course, but you should resemble him. Yeah. That's the goal, right? Yeah. And everything that we can to work to resemble him in our day-to-day lives.
Darren, incredible. Always love talking with you. Love what you're doing. And thank you for taking this journey because you're helping others, whether you see it or not. You're helping others and stay at it.
Appreciate it. I appreciate it very much. I'm very honored to be on your program. I hope your listeners, your viewers really get some benefit and they start digging in and pursuing.
I greatly appreciate, Darren, this conversation. I want to throw a few quotes from this book to you. I hope you check out the book. You can find it on Amazon, anywhere you buy books. Here's a few quotes that really captivated me from the book. Quoting Bill Hull, Darren writes, when we understand the requirements of the first century, the fog lifts from how we should be and make disciples now. Darren writes, the process of discipleship was a complete shaping of a new rabbi, a passing on of everything the rabbi had, his character, his knowledge, his values, and his wisdom. And one more, Jesus developed a mentoring relationship with his disciples who learned from his teachings by heart and followed his example as apprentices. Jesus' teaching techniques have deep roots in Jewish education of the day. One of the statements I keep saying throughout this series is we only know what we know. I love how Darren shared his life, his ministry as a journey, leaning into the Lord, leaning into truth, following the Holy Spirit, and where it's taken him. We all need that journey. That's why I hope you're noticing these episodes, their journey. We're learning together. I decided to take this fully integrated faith series rather than me just starting with, this is fully integrated faith. It's really peeling back some things that we may not know. But we can only pass on the Christianity we know. But our role as parents, we're making disciples. We need to make sure we have a biblical view of what discipleship is. I think Darren helps us simplify what we need to do and what we need to pass down. You've been listening to Stand Firm Parents. Stand Firm Parents is a production of Stand Firm Ministries in partnership with Life Word Studios, created by Jake McCandless and Brandon Harrington of Dime Collective. Again, thank you for listening, and be sure to subscribe, share, and most importantly, stand firm.